Today I'm going to take a bit of a break from politics and discuss philosophy. All of our intellectual pursuits are foundational in knowledge, and epistemology is the study of the foundations and operation of knowledge. It would be quite useless to advance a belief if we weren't aware of the conditions for the belief to be justified, or if we didn't have an adequate grasp on what is necessary for a belief to be true. At its core, epistemology is a study of belief and these conditions. The book Epistemology, Classic Problems and Contemporary Responses by Lawrence BonJour gives a brief adumbration of the state of epistemology and the problems that are regularly discussed. It begins with the Cartesian point of view, which for centuries has been the cornerstone of epistemological inquiry. Descartes aimed to determine whether he could produce beliefs which he was certain were true, arguing that nothing else constitutes knowledge. This is the strong conception of knowledge, which is contrasted against the weak conception of knowledge, i.e., that beliefs are more likely than not to produce truth. The Cartesian outlook begins with a kind of skeptical thought experiment. What if there were what he calls an evil genius that was capable of deceiving us about all of our experiences to such an extent that ordinary common sense knowledge was unreliable? To give an example from the book, suppose we saw a tree outside our window. Can we know that what we are seeing is a tree, or that the tree even exists? According to Descartes, since we could be deceived about the content of our sensory experiences, we are not justified in declaring that what we see is indeed a tree. The goal of Descartes is not to be satisfied with this degree of skepticism, however. He aimed to find a way to justify knowledge about the external world despite this unreliability. The Cartesian response to this skepticism starts with what has been called the cogito, which you might know as the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes supposed that of all possible beliefs, he can be justified in knowing that he is a thinking being, that his thoughts are the one thing that the evil genius cannot deceive him about. From this, he extends that awareness of the content of his experiences and mental states is certain as well, even if they might be produced via deception. He then argues that, according to what he calls the light of nature, that certain kinds of knowledge are self-evident. Lawrence interprets this to mean that a priori arguments are in themselves sufficient justifications for belief. Descartes then employs an appeal to God to bridge the gap between his experiences and the external world, as well as to defeat solipsism. God is very much the opposite of the evil genius, insofar as he is either incapable of or unwilling to deceive us. Because God exists, there might be some connection between our experiences and the world, sufficient to overcome our skepticism about our sensory experiences. The way he proves the existence of God is by arguing that every effect must contain as much reality as its cause, and since nothing comes from nothing, God must exist. BonJour argues that this specific argument, this appeal to God, is philosophically untenable because it is essentially an unjustified belief in itself. There are many alternative explanations for the existence of the world that are equally valid. This would be the position of a genuine skeptic, but if we assume that God is true, which can be justified in a number of other ways, such as the 5 ways of Aquinas or simply an act of faith, that he has the specified quality of non-deception as well, then Descartes indeed has a strong argument. I do not wish to imply that BonJour is denying God. He is simply raising skeptical alternatives and asking questions, which is due diligence in epistemology. But in this channel, I think most of us probably agree that God is real beyond any serious doubt. And so we can, without reservation, accept this argument as a strong basis for epistemology. Despite that, there are still a number of challenges to the Cartesian view that are relevant. For example, what is the nature of sensory experiences? Is there even an external world that produces sensory experiences? The British empiricists like John Locke argued that they are comprised of sense data, which are foundational on ideas of sense. Fundamentally, then, sensory experiences are conceptual in nature. If I see a tree, then I do not directly experience the true nature of that tree or any tree in and of itself, but rather my senses give me a conception of what I am looking at, and it is this conception which forms my experience. This is called representative realism. But can this result in truth? Can I really be certain about the nature and qualities of what I am looking at? BonJour argues no. For example, if I view a table from a certain angle, I might see that it appears to have a trapezoidal shape. I could then be mistaken about what the actual shape of the table is, and so my belief about the table's qualities would be unjustified. Therefore, sense data is unreliable. There are various responses to this problem. The most untenable is direct realism, in which it is argued that our perceptual experiences do not involve any conceptual content and instead directly produce experiences about what is perceived. The obvious problem is whether we can even have an experience of something without conceptual content or an idea of sense. Another problem regards the argument from illusion, in which hallucinations or illusions appear real despite not being actual. Regarding the problem of existence of an external world, one response is phenomenalism. Phenomenalists argue that instead of there existing an external world, there are instead internal sensory roots that constitute the experience of a world. But the question is what accounts for the consistency of these sensory roots or the existence of unobserved change in the world. For example, what is happening while we are away. BonJour's preferred approach is representative realism, which is the argument advanced by Locke, in which our perception of the external world is essentially conceptual and justified by a priori argumentation. Most of modern epistemology has taken the form of alternatives to Cartesianism in response to the argument that it has, for one reason or another, failed to produce justification for our beliefs and sensory experiences. One such example is coherentism. Cartesianism is an example of foundationalism, or the approach that all knowledge originates from unrefutable positions or basic beliefs. Coherentism denies that foundationalism can arrive at unrefutable beliefs and still supposes that the degree of coherence of beliefs with each other arrives at a greater likelihood of producing truth. Of course, this sidesteps the original goal of Cartesian epistemology to arrive at beliefs that are absolutely certain, but also has a major problem, which is whether coherence itself can produce truth. For example, BonJour says that a novel has a high degree of coherence, but it is still a fictional story. We also have the problem of how we assess and define coherence, which is basically unanswerable in any certain way. Second, we have the externalists who argue that justification is the result of external processes that are reliable. For example, if I see a chair, then it is because the physiological process that produced the experience of a chair functions properly and consistently. If the process is reliable, a concept called reliabilism, then we can argue that it justifies my belief that I'm seeing a chair. Of course, externalists cannot really claim that reliable processes are more likely to produce truth, just that they reliably produce a given result, so it does not fundamentally answer Cartesian skepticism. Third, we have the psychologism advanced by Willard Van Orman Quine, who denied the validity of a priori proofs and instead argued that epistemology was essentially an empirical, psychological question that could be externally studied, i.e., what the process of belief formation exhibits in the physical world. However, BonJour argues that psychologism generally does not conflict with traditional epistemology and offers little insight into its essential problems, such as the justification for an external world or whether our beliefs can be completely certain. Further, Quine makes a number of errors and bad arguments for his skepticism against a priori argumentation. For example, he argues that a priori arguments require one to understand a number of different interdefinitive terms, such as belief, necessary, etc., and as such there is no way into this epistemic circle. But obviously, as BonJour points out, if you believe words have meanings, then a priori arguments are still intelligible. Also, Quine fails to justify how the empirical process by which we study belief formation can possibly lead to truth or be justified. Even worse, Quine's position itself is an a priori argument, so his theory ends up collapsing in on itself. Lastly, BonJour briefly mentions Richard Rorty's rejection of epistemology. Rorty basically argues that justification of knowledge is a social rather than strictly cognitive process, and as such, a belief is justified simply when it is accepted by a given community. This is part of a number of responses that simply evade skepticism rather than answering any fundamental questions about the certainty of belief. For these reasons, BonJour thinks that Cartesianism remains a defensible and central approach in epistemology, combined with representative realism. Still, if one decides to remain skeptical regarding God, then the problem of whether we can justify an external world is still an open question. BonJour makes it quite plain that there are several insoluble problems in epistemology, like the problem of induction, which he attempts to answer using an a priori argument, as well as the fundamental problem of the justification of an external world.